Hey YouTube, this is Styles by Nina coming at ya. We're going to look over the Pyramididiots, and this is pseudoscience, pseudo-archaeology, and ancient Egypt. Now, I already recorded this, and I made a mistake and erased it or didn't save it to the computer. So I'm just going to start over, and hopefully I can get through it a little better because I was stuttering a little. Now, this is Pyramididiots. Pyramididiots. Okay. Pyramididiots. And this is characterized by having outlandish, far-fetched theories about the origin, nature, or purpose of the Egyptian pyramids, often characterized by the feeling that academic Egyptologists are hiding the truth, or lack the open-mindedness to recognize the truth of what the Pyramididiots believe. Now, the 19th century Pyramididiots, and they are George Stanley Faber, and he is responsible for a dissertation of the mysteries of the Kabiri in 1803, the origin of pagan idolatry in 1816, and he proposed similarities in shape and structure among the pyramids of Egypt, Mayan pyramids, and the biblical Tower of Babel. Each of these structures, my apologies, I'm working. So each of these structures represented attempts to erect copies of Mount Ararat, upon which the Ark of the Old Testament supposedly rested. John Wilson, between 1852 and 1856, John Wilson published The Lost Solar System of the Ancients Discovered. Measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza contained the key to historical and scientific secrets. From the measurements of the Great Pyramid, he extrapolated the distance from the Earth and the Sun. Taken from the bent pyramid of the shore, he derived the diameter of Jupiter, and taken from the hypostyle hall of the Karnak temple, he derived the orbit of Saturn. Now, John Taylor, in 1860, the Great Pyramid, why was I built, and who built it? The architect of the pyramid was not an Egyptian, but was the biblical Noah. The Great Pyramid contains secrets of which the ancient Egyptians themselves were unaware. Sacred cubit, sacred cubit, identical to the cubit that the Israelites had used during biblical times. Piazzi's Smith, life and work at the Great Pyramid, 1867 through. The pyramid was not an Egyptian monument. It was the oldest man-made structure, and the remainder of the Egyptian pyramids, in his opinion, were only filthy pagan imitations. Native Egyptians furnished the labor to build the structure. The architect was an unknown person from the Old Testament. The pyramid was a perfect structure, a product of divine inspiration, which embodied in its measurement a perfect system of weights and measures. By the use of a series of mathematical formulas, Smith intended to unlock the secrets of the Great Pyramid. He enlisted support from two groups: the opponents to the introduction of the metric system into England, and anti-evolutionists. Ignatius Donnelly, in 1831, he studied law and eventually went on to become one of the youngest lieutenant governors of Minnesota. He later went on to serve several terms in the Federal House of Representatives and ran twice as the Vice President of the United States. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, that was his book. It's a modern revised edition here on the screen. The Antediluvian World, published in 1882, is the Bible for the belief in the legend. His approach was totally indiscriminate. He never met an absurd theory about Atlantis that he didn't like or include in his book. The central premise of the book is that the Atlantis story told by Plato in Timaeus and Crassus dialogues is not a legend but veritable history. Atlantis was the region where man first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. Atlantis was the source of civilization in Egypt, South America, Mexico, Europe, and North America. And again, this is a map showing you where Atlantis used to be, which is here. Can't zoom in on it. And it uses cultural comparison in order to prove the truth of the Atlantis story. He maintains that if we then prove that on both sides of the Atlantic, civilizations were found substantially identical, we have demonstrated that they must have descended one from the other or have radiated from some common source. Donnelly was a diffusionist. And this is a warning, anthropology stuff ahead. It's warning us. And diffusion means it's a concept used to describe the spread of cultural items such as ideas, styles, religions, technologies, language, etc. between individuals, whether within a single culture or from one culture to another. We believe that the common source of all civilization was Atlantis. It presents a series of artifacts or behaviors which he finds to be identical among civilizations of the old and new worlds. And these comparisons, Donnelly presents what he believes is the clearest evidence for the existence of Atlantis. And these are obelisk that he believes that they were Egyptian obelisk and Mesoamerican stelae. They are derived from the same source. That's what he believes. These are pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mesoamerica, and they can be traced to the same source. And these are arches. Ancient cultures in the old and new worlds possess the ark, and it's because y'all came in and conquered. That would be why. To answer about those arches. But anyway, cultures in the old and new worlds both produce bronze. I don't know about producing. But we can say they both, one may have produced and the other, came on the end part and claimed to produce. I'm not sure. But just listening to some of this history, that's usually how things went down. Civilizations in both the old and new worlds were dependent on agricultural economies for their subsistence. This indicates that these cultures were derived from a common source. Ever hopeful of the legitimacy of his argument, Donnelly ended Atlantis, the antediluvian world, by stating, "We are on the threshold. Scientific investigation is advancing in great strides. Who shall say that 100 years from now the great museums of the world may not be adorned with gems, statues, arms, and implements from Atlantis, while the libraries of the world shall contain translations of its inscriptions, throwing new lights upon all past history of the human race and all the great problems which now perplex the thinkers of our day." Now, Edgar Cayce, it sounds so familiar, between 1904 and 1910, in a small town in Kentucky called Hopkinsville, Edgar Cayce first demonstrated his so-called psychic powers. In the late 1920s, Edgar Cayce moved his growing family to the sand hills of Virginia Beach, where he dreamed of establishing a curing hospital using his psychic readings. Edgar Cayce, who by this time was widely referred to as the Sleeping Prophet, founded the Association for Research and Enlightenment, ARE, an organization designed to support and archive his readings. Cayce's archaeological insights were primarily given to questioners as context for their previous lives. Cayce pronounced that the great many of his followers were reincarnations of citizens of Atlantis. The legendary sunken continent was mentioned in more than 30% of his collected readings. Casey documentation, which covers a period of 50,000 BC and 10,000 BC of the fictional civilization, is especially rich and is also where we find the Egyptian connection. He asserted that Atlantis had been a once powerful and extremely advanced civilization that had once possessed technology such as laser beams, aircraft, and radios. However, though an unknown series of events, Atlantis had been destroyed. The citizens of Atlantis, however, used their crude aircraft to flee the sinking continent to France, Egypt, and the Yucatan Peninsula. In Egypt, the Atlanteans made their mark on the civilization by building the Sphinx around 10,500 BC in the likeness of one of their rulers. Before building the Sphinx, the Atlanteans constructed an immense library in the Giza Plateau, which Casey called the Hall of Records, which contained all the knowledge of their vastly superior civilization. Eric von Däniken, in 1968, Chariots of the Gods, he proposed that there was indisputable and copious archaeological evidence for his claim that extraterrestrial beings had visited Earth in prehistoric times and played a major role in the development of humanity. Hypothesis 1, Inkblot Hypothesis. All over the world, there are prehistoric pictorial and three-dimensional representations, which are drawings on cave walls, pottery, and sculptures, as well as early written accounts that can be most reasonably interpreted as drawing sculptures or literary descriptions by primitive people of actual extraterrestrial visitors to Earth. No real identifiable image in the inkblot picture. The image you recognize comes from your imagination. Now, the images are part of a different cultures. Images have a context not immediately apparent to those who do not explore further. You can just see or read anything you want into them, just like ink blots. No understanding of the religious, artistic, or historic context of the drawings or images within the cultures that produce them. A perfect example of von Däniken's inkblot hypothesis is the famous sarcophagus lid from the Mayan site of Palenque. For von Däniken, the image represents an astronaut complete with antenna and an oxygen mask peering through a telescope and manipulating the controls of a rocket. Okay, maybe. Hypothesis 2, amorphous astronaut. The biological evolution of the human species cannot be understood unless we assume the involvement of a scientifically advanced extraterrestrial civilization. A group of extremely advanced interstellar space travelers land on Earth in the neighborhood of 1 million years ago. They find a primitive species of creatures very ape-like with small brains but with a lot of potential. Then von Däniken claims that a few specially selected women would be fertilized by the astronauts. Thus, a new race would arise that skipped a stage in natural evolution. Hypothesis 3, our ancestors, the dummies. Some ancient artifacts and inventions are far too advanced and complex to have resulted from simple prehistoric human intelligence and ingenuity. These advanced artifacts and great inventions must instead be the direct result of purposeful introduction by extraterrestrial aliens. Prehistoric accomplishments such as plant domestication, the development of metallurgy, and astronomical abilities could not have possibly developed without the aid of extraterrestrial beings. There are two contributing factors to von Däniken's misinterpretation of the archaeological record. He is completely ignorant of simple archaeological facts.